Thank you everybody for joining and welcome to my presentation on soil biology and its applications to promote abundance in your garden. The presentation, I would say, should last about 35 minutes or so, 40 minutes, and then we will, like she said, have question and answers after that. So let's just go ahead and jump in. Let's see here. So I just want to start and give you guys a little background about me. I am a permaculture designer. For those of you who don't know what permaculture is a method of design that utilizes the principles found in nature to create abundance with minimal inputs and maintenance. I am also a water harvesting designer, which is a certificate that you can obtain from the Watershed Management Group in Tucson, Arizona. I'm also the founder of a nonprofit based primarily in Contra Costa County called Transformative Soil and Landscapes. And our mission is to promote community and health by installing edible food forests in people's backyards, utilizing volunteers to make our work more economical for households. And much of what we are going to go over today is based on the work of Elaine Ingham, who developed the Soil Foodweb School and certified me to analyze soil and compost under a microscope in order to determine its health and ability to grow healthy plants. And then lastly, I'm a program manager at Sustainable Solano, and the program that I manage is called Solano Gardens. We install productive gardens in the community in Solano County that is then harvested and used to feed underprivileged households. So final note here, I'm not a professional speaker, but, and actually this is my first ever Zoom presentation. So I hope that you'll bear with me. I got into this field because of my passion and love for nature and amazing healthful food, not necessarily because I love presentations. Anyway, so let's move on. And I wanted to actually talk a little bit about how I became interested in this work as well. So a little bit of history about me. I came to be involved with this work starting back in 2010. At the time, there was a number of documentaries that were really popular: Food Matters, Food Inc., and then there was a guy named Jamie Oliver who was starting the food revolution in schools. So I was learning a lot about the food systems and a lot about the corruption between companies like Monsanto, who were responsible for many of our GMOs, Roundup or glyphosate, and then a lot of the lawsuits that they were imposing on many of the small scale farmers. So I found myself really angered by this system, and I wanted to be a part of that change. So I started a company called Doorstep Farmers. We delivered organic produce from local farms to people's doorsteps, primarily in Contra Costa County, in order to start educating the community about the importance of supporting these farms. So some of my first farms were like in Martinez and Sandell, Fremont and things like that. And we'd aggregate that produce and deliver it to people's doorsteps. I did that for about 8 years, but found that as more and more people started to catch on to the importance of local small scale farming, I was wanting to get more intimately connected to nature and growing my own food and self-sustainability. So after a few years of contemplating how to exit that business, I found myself a little lost in how to proceed forward with a calling that I couldn't quite place. I found an apprenticeship at the oldest organic farm west of the Mississippi called Earth Dance Organic Farm School. It was in St. Louis. And I ended up taking a permaculture design class too while I was out there. I quickly was finding that certain areas of this industry were really attractive to me and got me really excited. Those things were permaculture, rainwater catchment, and soil biology. I spent the next few years on varying projects, designing permaculture, backyards, and and other systems and implementing soil biology wherever I could. And then soil biology has been perhaps one of the most fascinating subjects to me, as it provides us a way out of the climate mess we are in, and the most healthy plants. It produces the most healthy plants, and then in turn, the most healthy food available on the planet. So it's really exciting stuff. And so I'm excited to share that with all of you guys today. So the information that I'm going to be presenting today is largely based on the work of Dr. Elaine Ingham, who is considered by many in the field to be the world's foremost soil biologist. She has spent the last 45 years doing research and found that there is a living network of microscopic beings in the soil that are vital to the health of our ecosystem. She named this network the soil food web, which is essentially the interplay of many different types of organisms in the soil, including worms, fungi, bacteria, and so forth. She found that only with the complete soil food web in place can the ecological functions of the soil be restored, which includes protecting and purifying the world's waterways, reversing climate change, and providing super nutritious foods. In other words, each one of these different organisms in the soil food web must be present in order to have healthy soils. This is a radically different approach to what we have been doing in agriculture for the last 100 years, which is really ripping up our soils through tilling and spraying and toxic chemicals through fertilizers and pesticides. We have literally been killing all the life in the soil, which is so vital for our health and the health of the planet. So what we must do is change our thinking and get back in touch with and work with microbial life. It's not about using chemicals to fix a problem. It's about stewarding the microbes and giving them the right conditions to thrive. This line of thinking is even more, or it's even moving past, I should say, organic, since organics still uses fertilizers and pesticides, which still kills the biology. So while this information has not been known a while, it's just starting to, or it has been known a while, I should say. It's just starting to make its way into the mainstream. Many growers are starting to transition their practices to be more biologically focused versus chemically focused. And that's really what Dr. Elaine Ingham is passionate about, and what I'm learning how to do as one of her consultants. So in this presentation, we're going to cover some plant basics, go more in depth about the soil food web, and discuss ways you can start to implement these biological practices at home. And I just wanted to also quickly stop here and just provide a screenshot of the Soil Food Web's website, which I'm going to provide also in our resources at the end of the presentation. But they have a lot of good resources regarding the topics we'll be discussing today. And as well as this page here is a lot of the really incredible case studies that they have. So some of these videos are just amazing to watch, really inspiring. And so, like I said, we'll provide the link at the end of the presentation, and then also along with some other resources in email to all of you guys. So starting off with the plant basics, I just want to briefly talk about this. All plants need nutrients, and all plants photosynthesize. So that's really basic. Let's start with some of the nutrients that some of you may be familiar with. If you're new to gardening, maybe you're not so familiar with it, and it's okay because it's not going to be as important when you're working with soil biology. But this is the primary nutrients are NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. You'll see it on bags of fertilizer. There's usually like 3 numbers. It might say like 555 or 121 or whatever. Those represent these nutrients. We have secondary nutrients and trace minerals that many growers aren't as familiar with, but they are equally as important in healthy and nutritious, delicious food, just as it is to our bodies. Many conventional farmers and gardeners believe that a good fertilizer is the answer. So I have a question for all of you to consider. What percentage of nutrients do you think is needed to grow most plants, or excuse me, what percentage of nutrients needed to grow most plants resides in our soils? And then what percentage of those nutrients do you think that we need to add in? So just consider that for a second. And the answer actually is that 100% of the nutrients needed to grow most plants are in most soils. We don't need to add any nutrients. We just need to unlock them. So that's key. We need to unlock those nutrients. So consider this for a second. Nobody ever fertilized an old growth forest, but yet it's so abundant. So imagine if you could create a garden with this kind of abundance here and never had to fertilize. So what's going on here? This is what we're going to talk about. Enter the soil food web. So the soil food web is nature's way of growing amazingly healthy plants. Let's talk about that for a second. So in many ways, the nutrient cycle, it starts with photosynthesis. Plants harvest energy from the sun to break apart the carbon and oxygen bonds found in CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. The plants off-gas the oxygen, as many of you probably know, and then they use that carbon to form different types of structures and sugars. So the bodies of plants and things like that are largely carbon, but they also use some of that carbon to create sugars. Let's see. And what the plants do is that they actually use those sugars to feed and exchange nutrients with other members of the soil food web. So if we were to look at healthy soil and roots under a microscope, we would find bacteria, we would find protozoa, fungi, and we'd find nematodes. These are the main ones that I focus on. Microarthropods and arthropods are also important, but the main ones that I like to focus on under a microscope are those four. So let's take a second real quick to talk about the bacteria and fungi as well really quick. Bacteria and fungi, they have particular enzymes that are able to mine for minerals and nutrients from the rocks and minerals that are in the soils. So a lot of our soils and the parent material, it's already got calcium, it's got magnesium, it's got silica, it's got all of that, but it's in the form of like rocks and minerals. And so it's hard to access by like plants. Plants can't really access it. But bacteria and fungi have enzymes that can actually mine that parent material, and they can unlock those minerals and then absorb it within their body. So that's the beginning of unlocking those minerals. Going back to the plants, they have roots, and those roots send out exudates, which is kind of like our sweat. These exudates, they contain foods for the bacteria and fungi, and then the plants are able to get nutrients from the fungi and from the bacteria that were mined by that fungi and bacterial in a couple of different ways. In the case of fungi and plants, they form a mutualistic relationship, and they exchange different nutrients with each other. In the case of bacteria, we actually need the other ones that I focus on, the protozoa and the nematodes. What they do, the protozoa and the nematodes, is they come along and they actually predate on the bacteria. When the predators eat the bacteria, the nutrient content is too rich for these larger microbes. And so what happens to those excess nutrients? Those excess nutrients are expelled at the point basically of the root zone. So remember, the bacteria is exchanging nutrients with the roots. So the bacteria is there at the root zone. And when the protozoa and the fungi, or excuse me, the protozoa and the nematodes come along and eat that bacteria, it then expels those excess nutrients right at the root zone of the plants. So the plants can actually select for what types of bacteria they want and everything at every point on their roots in order to get the exact nutrients they need. So whereas you may add fertilizer to soil, you're going to be adding it to all the soil, and some areas of the roots may not need it. Some may be in the like form it needs, may not. but with plants, they can actually select exactly for what types of nutrients they want from the bacteria. So it's a complex cycle that continues from the smallest of organisms up into the largest of organisms, including us. So when we look at a garden such as this one, this is a project that I did in Martinez. And in this picture, this is only 5 months old. We installed it back in April last year, and then this picture, I believe, was taken in October of last year. So it's a really, really young garden. But when we look at this garden, I not only see a backyard of plants, I see a solar farm. All of these green leaves are all photosynthesizing. They're all using that energy to absorb CO2 from the air, break that carbon from the oxygen, and then use that carbon to feed an entire microbial community that's under the ground where we can't even see. So under the ground, when I look at the ground, under the ground, I'm also seeing and envisioning this whole world of bacteria and fungi that are mining the parent material, starting the process of this whole microbial community, all giving life and nutrients to the plants. So it's a really beautiful world when you can see it in that through that lens, and we don't want to disturb it. We don't want to be adding fertilizers and pesticides to that. So yeah, I know that was probably a lot for everybody, but I hope that we can answer any of those questions about that at the end. I just want to discuss some of the other functions of the soil food web. So again, the soil food web facilitates nutrient cycling. Now, we won't be able to talk too much about the nutrient cycling today, get into too much detail, but it also provides some disease and pest resistance. Now, this is because if you have adequate numbers of healthy microbes, they will use up the resources provided by the plants. So all those sugars, the healthy microbes will use up all of those nutrients, and the bad guy microbes and insects can't come in and go rampant. There's no room for them. Additionally, stronger plants release different enzymes and chemicals that choose for healthy organisms and repel pests. Lastly, a healthy soil food web will create great soil structure, which will help with water retention, and it'll make it easier for roots to spread deeper and deeper into the soil, accessing more nutrients, more water, and stuff like that. The way the structure is improved is a long talk in itself, but briefly, picture a worm going through the soil, and it's tunneling around and creating pathways for air, and its slime is gluing dirt together. Well, now picture thousands of worms going through that soil. You have soil that begins to start to resemble like a sponge. Now picture that happening with bacteria, with protozoa, with nematodes, beetles, etc. All the soil food web going through and forming different aggregates with its glue, and small aggregates from bacteria becoming bigger aggregates from fungi coming in and wrapping around it and creating all this different structure within the soil. So to give you guys an idea of the amount of life that we are talking about, you can think of this. So there are more organisms in 1 tablespoon of healthy soil than there are people on Earth. Maybe some of you have heard of that, but that's a lot of life inside just a tablespoon of soil, of healthy soil. And to just touch on this notion just a little bit further and to see where the direction we need to head in is, this graph compares agricultural soil to that of prairie soil and then forest soil. And you'll notice that in particular, the amount of protozoa, the amount of nematodes, and the amount of fungi is higher in forest soils and in healthier ecosystems. So our goal is to try to move along our soil on this level of succession by cultivating and introducing these different types of microbes. Now, I have a real quick video to demonstrate a little bit about soil structure and its retention with water and runoff. It's only about a minute or so. Basically, what he's doing is he's demonstrating how soil structure functions. And so the bread kind of represents good structure, and the flour represents like a lot of our agricultural soil, like soil. So this is basically, he's got holes in this cup, and he's pouring water into it, and the water is going to pass through it like rainfall. And you can see how the water isn't able to absorb or collect. It just kind of runs off, bringing with it flour and all that kind of stuff. So that's representing our topsoil. With the bread, it's able to actually absorb into it, and it also is able to filter the water out as well. So when it leaves the system, it actually filters and cleans the water for you. So yeah, so like I said, we'll provide that video, but that just demonstrates really the importance of soil structure in water retention, as well as actually cleaning the water within our watershed. Okay, so I want to briefly discuss what went wrong with our current farming and gardening practices. So in the 1800s, during the agricultural revolution, we began tilling. The estimate is that we are now losing about 1% of our topsoil every year to erosion. Most of this is caused by agriculture. The United States is losing soil at a rate 10 times faster than the soil replenishment rate. So tilling the soil chops and blends soil microbes, destroying the life in the soil that cycles nutrients and creates structure. And it also creates runoff, which gives us basically loss of structure and roots, makes runoff more common. We lose nutrients and we lose topsoil in that process of runoff. In addition to tilling, the application of toxic chemicals in the form of fertilizers and pesticides destroys not just the targeted organisms, but it also destroys our beneficial microbes. And we are then left without nature's nutrient cycling. And then you become stuck really in a fertilizer pesticide death spiral. Also, we have, there are microbes on foliage that form a barrier that prevents disease organisms from infiltrating such as like molds and things like that from infiltrating the leaf structure. And the microbes also help with photosynthesis. So when you apply pesticides to the leaves, you're destroying that microbial life in that shield, that barrier. So there is a more peaceful and healthy way. There are a handful of techniques, biological techniques, and things that you can do to start working with biology and not against it. The first thing we need to do is we need to stop disrupting microbes and destroying soil by tilling or by pulling plants out by the roots. We need to be sure we aren't walking on and compacting the soil. So that includes, hoeing and all that kind of stuff. We really want to try to disturb the soil as little as possible. We want to think of soil as an ecosystem, not just plants. Second thing we want to do is we want to cover and protect our soil. And this is because nature abhors bare soil. There are a few ways that we can do this. The best ways in your garden are to either use wood chips, which I like to use in our pathways a lot. You'll see this is that garden again, and that's in Martinez, and we use wood chips in the pathways. And actually, in addition, we also dug out all of the pathways about 2 feet deep and 2 feet wide in order to have a place for water to hold and retain in. So all of our pathways are not just covered with wood chips, but they're also dug out to provide additional wood chips and rainwater storage. And then the other thing you can do is you can use low growing ground covers like creeping thyme, Roman chamomile, microclovers, dichondra, etc. I also like to use strawberries are a great like edible cover as well, and they're not as low growing as some of these ones listed here. But basically, I like to make sure that we cover every inch of the soil. You think back to our example of that solar farm, the more plants and roots we have in the ground, the more energy we are mining from the sun, and the more sugar is being fed to the microbes, and which in turn, again, is mining all of those nutrients from the parent material. So I like to have as much roots in the ground as I can. Also, as those plants die off, you have a lot of roots that are in the ground that are also creating organic matter in the soil and just continuously adding to the structure. So you see that the more plants you have, the better it actually is for the entire system. Looking at this slide again, you can see that given the opportunity, nature will cover just about every square inch with live plants. The next thing we need to do is to filter out the chlorine and chloramine from our water source. These chemicals are added into our municipal water to kill microbes. And I feel like this is one thing that makes like a huge difference in many people's gardens that I work with. I mean, how can you start to create a rich microbial universe under the ground when you're sterilizing them with the water you use? So this is one of my favorite filters that's available online through a local company out of Roner Park called Boogie Brew. I wouldn't worry about any of the other products on their website, but this product is a critical part, in my opinion, of growing abundantly. You can use also whole house filters, but this filter is really great. You can put it in line with your hose. I've also rigged it up for to be used with like drip irrigation. There are some limitations as far as water pressure when using like drip, but again, that chlorine and chloramine for me isn't even an option. So it's really critical. And it's about $50 or $60 for that water filter, and it probably would last you in a complete growing season. Lastly, we need to introduce biology into our soil. Pretty much all soil has some bacteria, unless there's maybe lead or something like that in the ground. But under a microscope, pretty much every soil that I look at has some bacteria. But we need to increase the diversity. We also want to make sure that most of it is anaerobic bacteria, not anaerobic, aerobic, not anaerobic. And then most soils are depleted of protozoa. They're depleted of the nematodes and very little fungi. So the question is, how do we introduce more biology? So let's talk about that. These are the ways that we introduce biology. So compost is the biggest tool that we have, which is basically decomposed organic matter. And that's decomposed by all those microbes, bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, fungi. And then from that compost, we make compost extracts and teas. Extracts and teas are produced the ones that we produce are used, we use high quality compost. Now, extracts and teas are two very different products, and they have different uses that I will go into. All right, so many people are familiar with compost, but not all compost is created equally. Good compost suppliers should be able to provide you with test records which indicate the numbers of nematodes, the fungal to bacteria ratio, the numbers of bacteria, and the number of protozoa. So that's key. If they're not able to provide you those numbers, then they likely are not composting in the way that it needs to be compost, which is aerobic, thermophilic composting. To go into this a little further, I've done workshops on making compost, but to make what Dr. Lane Ingham terms as biocomplete compost, or compost that has all the microbes that we've discussed, and in large enough quantities to be effective in colonizing the soil and cycling the nutrients, we need compost. We need to compost in a very particular way, like I said, thermophilic and aerobic. And it has to be done with a particular recipe that you like work on, with certain different types of high nitrogen content, carbon content, things like that. We work on those recipes, and then we analyze it under a microscope to ensure that it has, again, all the quantities of all the different microbes and the different ratios that we need to grow specifically what we're wanting to grow. So one company that I know of that does this really well is a company out of Grass Valley called Catalyst Bio Amendments. The owners are really great people, and they also went through Elaine Ingham's Soil Foodweb School. They, like me, are certified lab technicians, and they analyze the compost under a microscope to ensure that it's microbially complete. Notice that their bag has holes in it. That's to provide oxygen to all of the microbes, because again, the microbes are aerobic microbes. There we go. They're aerobic microbes. And I will say that this compost is more expensive than your run-of-the-mill compost. I think that this bag probably is around like $20 or $30, and it's a pretty small bag. But it's because it has all those microbes, and the way that you use it is different than you would regular compost. Regular compost being like provides a good amount of organic matter for your soil potentially, if it hasn't been done anaerobic and it doesn't have anaerobic microbes. But this compost, we're really wanting it just for the microbes. So you have the amazing compost, but now how do we apply it? So we have 3 application methods. First would be direct application. This can be done when prepping your beds. You can mix it in when you're prepping your beds. It can be done as a side dressing to existing plants, so you can just kind of put it on top and water it in. Or it can be put in the hole as you're transplanting your plants, and that's one of my favorite methods for this type of application. With compost extracts, we take the microbially complete compost, and then we agitate it in a paint strainer in a very specific way, with using our hand and trying to create air streams and water streams that go through that compost and are trying to remove the biology from the aggregates and the organic material in the compost. We do it in a paint strainer, so basically we're trying to, the aim is to remove all the microbes from the surface of the compost, suspending it in that water. We then can do a root drench, where we're able to pour the microbes down into the soil and target the root zone of the plants so that the microbes can then colonize those roots and the soil. In some cases, we even can take big soil injectors like fertilizer injectors, and we can plug that into the soil at like the roots of trees and stuff, and apply it that way, because and we'll do that a lot of times if there's like compaction in the soil, because the microbes will, like we said, will start to improve the structure of the soil, and that includes like clay soils that are really hard, really tight. By putting those microbes in there, they'll start to work on that structure. And so, like I said, we'll take it and actually inject it at the like compaction layers in the soil to help trees become healthier as well. So the third method, it involves taking that extract and then aerating it with an air pump and adding foods to the extract. We then do what's called brewing it, which isn't actually like heating it or anything. It's just that just oxygenating it. But we then brew that for 24 to 48 hours to allow the microbes to reproduce themselves and to form glues. So these glues are similar to that of bacteria that fix themselves to your teeth. You know, if you haven't brushed your teeth all day and you kind of get like a little bit of a film, that is the bacteria forming glues. So that way, when you take a drink of water, all that bacteria doesn't get washed away. They're able to stay there on your teeth. And so we want to give that time to the microbes in our compost teas to form those glues, so that when we spray the leaves of plants, when we do foliar applications, the microbes stick to the surface of those leaves and form a protective barrier on those leaves. So again, the extracts are optimal for root applications because they haven't formed those glues. They can then go down all the passageways and sink down to the root zone and also to the compaction layers. The compost tea is optimal for spraying the leaves where it can then stick. They'll reproduce on the leaves as well, and they'll form a barrier to protect the leaves as well as to help in increasing photosynthesis. So one thing I want to emphasize, and you can see by the way here, this woman spraying the leaves with the compost tea, but one thing I want to emphasize about these methods, there is a learning curve on the two liquid applications. You need to learn the good techniques for extracting the biology, as I said, and it takes practice. It's not that difficult. It's just something you need to like have somebody kind of show you how to do, or you can try your best to do it. But the other one is the compost teas. In terms of the compost tea, you need to have your recipe right. You need to have the right level of oxygen because again, we're dealing with aerobic microbes. And you ideally would be verifying under a microscope that you're having the type of growth that you want and that you're not brewing anaerobic, potentially pathogenic microbes. You could have your tea go anaerobic, which also could be harmful to your plants instead of helpful. So many of these techniques are used incorrectly by hobby gardeners. You'll see a lot of people touting compost teas and stuff like that, but many are used incorrectly by hobby gardeners. Many will use any old compost, and then many will use bad equipment or bad recipes, and then they're not able to verify their results under a microscope. So I recommend starting with the direct applications and the compost extracts, not the teas. Again, the extracts go to the roots. You can put all kinds of biology into your soil. So that's a really great way to get the microbes into the soil. The compost teas really should be under the guidance maybe of someone with the ability to look under a microscope, or they've developed a recipe for even the specific time of year, given temperature and things like that. All these different variants variables can affect your compost tea. So you want to be sure that you have some guidance, I would say. Okay, so with all that great biology in the ground, you need to make sure that you don't use any fertilizers or pesticides ever. In some rare circumstances, you can use things like neem oil or some other natural option, but you would then need to follow up with some application of extracts and teas because the neem oil will also kill some of your biology. Under most circumstances, never. I don't recommend any products to anybody ever. And so don't fall for any marketing ploys of it being all-purpose plant food or all natural, etc. So pop quiz on this notion. What about organic, like Dr. Earth, Premium Gold, Organic, Premium All-Purpose Fertilizer, people and pet safe? No. There are worse things, but no. And so now why not? The answer is complex, and honestly, Dr. Earth wouldn't be too bad. It even has some microbes. So you'll notice that a lot of products these days are also including microbes in the dormant stage. So these are different species of bacillus, which is an anaerobic microbe. And then it has different fungi. So you have endomycorrhizal and ectomycorrhizal, and that refers to the way in which they populate the roots, that the fungi populates the roots and forms that relationship with the fungi. In any case, so those are pretty great, but they are in a dormant stage, so they would need to have some kind of food that awakens them. But the issue really is more that the foods that they have in there, those are bacterial foods that will potentially feed bad bacteria. And then we have some potassium sulfate, which is actually a salt and can hurt your biology. So, and that's in a lot of these blends, unfortunately, has like some form of salt, and like I said, which can actually hinder your biology. Stick to that quality compost like we talked about. It has all of the nutrients you need, as well as largely diversified sets of organisms to continue that nutrient cycling. That's the important thing, is the organisms in there continuing that nutrient cycling. One other thing while I'm here, I will say too that when you're doing compost extracts, you'll see that there is a lot of like brown color, obviously, in the water. And that's a lot of humic acids and fulvic acids, different types of acids that are produced by like fungi. There's all sorts of like water soluble nutrients in there from the process of decomposition. So when you apply those compost extracts, you aren't only applying the biology, you are also applying a lot of water soluble, plant available nutrients. So you don't ever need to reach for any of these types of fertilizers if you're always doing those extracts. You'll not only be applying biology, but you will be applying available food as well. So to summarize and provide you with a garden abundance checklist, I want to read you this list. So again, we want to filter your water. That's very important. You want to disturb your soil as little as possible. You want to make sure to cover and protect your soil. You want to get roots in the ground. And then you want to use high quality compost, extracts and teas to inoculate and feed the soil microbiome. So if you do these 5 things, I feel really confident that many of you guys can really increase the abundance in your gardens, that you can help us to offset some of the effects of climate change, hopefully, at least do your part and grow some of the most healthy available food on the planet. One of the cool things about growing with biology too is that all that biology is going to be on the surface of this produce. And so when you're eating this produce too, you're also inoculating your own gut microbiome with all that biology and really promoting amazing health. And all of your produce will have more minerals and vitamins and all that kind of stuff as well. So I have some additional resources for all of you if you would like to take any of these things further. Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Foodweb School is an amazing resource to take these ideas further. In order to become certified, I had to go through like 120 hours of lecture and then work with a mentor from the school. So we went over the basics today, but there are so many additional principles that will help all of you take this work further. Um, I have two resources for filters. The one is the inline filter from Boogie Blue, and then there's another one that's a whole house filter, which is really cool as well, in my opinion, because then your showers and your kitchen water that you cook with and everything is filtered, which is also great for your own microbiome as well. And then lastly, the website for the company in Grass Valley that produces that amazing quality compost. So I just also want to provide you guys all some ways you can reach me if you have any questions. I have my main email there. I've got my LinkedIn. And then if it's related to my work over at Sustainable Solano, I have my Sustainable Solano email there. I hope that all of you learned something and that I have inspired you to grow with nature and not work against it. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole now, who I believe is going to open it up for questions and answers and maybe give you some information about a survey. So thank you so much for your time.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. That was great. I'm learning all the things that I'm doing wrong in my garden. So I'm going to ask everybody if you could take our short survey. This really helps us to select future classes. So it's not a long survey, but it helps us a lot. And this was a really great class. And I know that we've been getting some questions and that I've been kind of cut and pasting. I will also be sending out an email to everybody probably within a week. That's going to have the recorded version of this presentation, slides from the presentation, along with all the resource links that Michael provided, so you can kind of continue your research on soil biology. So I'm going to start with the first question, was about compost. What about compost I have in my home compost bin? Like how to handle that?
Yeah, so that's something that I've addressed a lot in a compost class. It's hard. So I have some preferences. I like worm bins a lot for composting because they take care of a lot of the potentially pathogenic microbes. And there's a lot of like great nutrients in it. But that's not to say that you shouldn't compost your own at home. What I would say is you can do different forms of like what's called static composting, which maybe some of you guys are doing. And then, but think of that more as applying like the organic matter to the ground, because it's not being done thermophilically. You're not killing pathogenic microbes. You're not sterilizing like weed seed and things like that. So it's not the most ideal circumstance. Also, when we're doing compost, we're monitoring like a 50% moisture content, which is like the ideal moisture for all of these organisms to reproduce, including fungi, which is like the hardest organism to cultivate, and that's probably the most important. So what I would recommend is using your compost for the organic matter, and then purchasing some of this more amazing like thermophilic compost that, again, you can ask the supplier or producer for the numbers, the microbial numbers, purchasing that and then doing those extracts and either inoculating your own compost with that extract. So you're putting all the biology into your own compost and it can grow out in there, or applying that as root drench to your soil. So your compost as like organic matter, microbial rich compost as your inoculation for your garden.
It's making it more complicated. So here's another question. Does the nutrients value changes depending on the material that you used in making your own compost?
Totally, yeah, completely. I mean, it's kind of like that notion that energy isn't created or destroyed, it only changes form. So if your inputs into your compost are plants that are growing in this biologically rich environment, and they've got all the minerals from the ground and all the nitrogen, and they're just like full spectrum plants. And then you compost that, well, all of those nutrients are going to be in that compost. They don't change form, they just continue in this nutrient cycle. And so yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, like I said, it's just all in that whole, it stays within that nutrient cycle. So the ingredients do matter, as well as the types of material. Like if you're using high nitrogen materials such as manure, we use that to heat the pile up, as well as to provide like food to bacteria. But then we have that high carbon material, which is like that really woody material, and that is providing food more for like the fungi. And so that's where we're trying to strike the balance in our recipes to create the right fungal to bacteria ratio, which is a whole nother complex subject, where you can actually select your microbial population for exactly what you're trying to grow, which helps to suppress weeds. So that's a little bit further down, but yeah.
And then we have a question about Bokashi composting at home. Would the tea from that be good enough? And then this person's been using neem cake fertilizer, and if I don't need it, I would rather not use it. So question about Bokashi and making tea from it.
So Bokashi is an anaerobic process. So we're using anaerobes to compost things. It's good maybe just, again, to provide the organic matter, but I would almost rather have a worm bin and then put that Bokashi into the worm bin before then putting it out into my garden.
Wow.
Yeah. As far as what it was about neem cakes, is that what it said?
Yeah. So it's she's been using neem cake fertilizer.
Okay, I'm not familiar with neem cake fertilizer, but really any fertilizers we really don't need. So it could be a waste of money, but at the very worst case scenario, it could be, it could have salts, or it could have some, like, again, neem I know has properties that are, that like does kind of kill off certain microbes, and so we want to, it can be a delicate system, and that's why we're also filtering out chlorine and chloramines. I mean, it can be a delicate system, but we just want to let nature like kind of take its course.
Okay. And then how long does it take for the soil to get in balance?
It can be really fast. Yeah, I mean, we can get soil, like dead soil, and we can turn it, or dead dirt, I would say, and we can turn it into live microbial rich soil within a growing season. Oftentimes with just 3 to 4 applications. And now it depends. If it's a property where maybe they were using like a lot of glyphosate, then we have to do a lot of inoculation. And one way that Dr. Elaine Ingham puts it that I really appreciate, is kind of like, colonial times, right? Like when pilgrims came to colonize, they set out, and the first ones that arrived here wasn't very hospitable, and so many of those the first settlers died. Maybe a couple like survived, and then another ship came, and it was a little bit easier, a little more hospitable, and so more were able to settle, and then more and more. So the more that you're able to like put some of the microbes in, the more hospitable it becomes for them, and so then it's able to like extrapolate out pretty fast.
So there was a question about where can they get their soil tested for bacteria and fungi, and this is a person in Florida that had their soil tested, but the results were only about minerals.
So what I would do, I do those testing. I do that type of testing, but I would recommend trying to find somebody closer to you, because you have to ship the soil sample, and we want to try to get it to its destination as soon as possible, because it can change in your bag, and like a soil lab technician like myself can inform you on how to prep the sample. So what I would do is look on the Soil Foodweb School's website, and there's a list of lab technicians as well as consultants. And you can contact a lab technician that's closer to you and send your soil to them to get all the full numbers of what you have, and then also maybe even some input on what you want to try to get it for what you're trying to grow.
So there's a question about soil pH and additives to get to neutral. What about soil pH and additives to get to neutral?
Soil pH is a fun one to talk about, because the reason why you have like tomatoes and blueberries, you hear they love acidic soil, right? And what it really is that in a forest you have fungally dominated soil. So in an old growth forest, fungally dominated soil, and the type of nitrogen that is produced by fungi is a more acidic type of nitrogen, and bacteria, they do more alkaline nitrogen. So that's where we really want to be working with that fungal to bacteria ratio to try to specifically grow what we want to grow. So if you're wanting to grow something like, just something on the early succession, like brassicas or something like that, you're going to have more bacterially dominated. You want more bacterially dominated soil. But if you're trying to grow something more like trees or an orchard, you want to have a little more fungally dominated soil. What is really cool about the soil biology is, again, the plants are able to select what microbes they want for what soil they want. So, the roots of a plant might want soil pH of like 6 here, but here want soil pH of like 7, and it can select exactly what it wants from the soil by putting out the exact exudates that it needs to put out to bring those microorganisms in. So as long as you have the biology there, you can start to drive more fungally dominated over time until you really strike that balance of what you want for what you're growing.
Ooh, so I'm hoping that I'm going to talk to you about how to get blueberries thriving, because dang, they do not like our Solano County soils.
Yeah.
They like the acidic. So a question about worm casting tea, is that a good thing?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It depends on what we're talking about. So a lot of worm castings, first off, they don't have a high fungi component, because the worms are constantly going through and eating everything and then grinding it up in their gizzards and then expelling the nutrients. But there's two different types of, like, what people call worm casting tea. The leachate, which is the stuff that is coming from the bottom, like coming out the bottom of your worm castings. So it's just kind of like leaching from your worm castings. That is anaerobic. That's not great stuff. That stuff you can maybe give it to your brassicas, because brassicas kind of like a little bit of anaerobic bacteria. But for the most part, like, that stuff is not great stuff. Doing an extract like we were talking about, where you're agitating the worm castings, that is going to extract all that good biology, which a lot of worm castings have all the protozoa, it's got the nematodes, it's got really great stuff. So doing an extract with your worm castings is great. Again, it's not going to be fungally dominated, so it's going to be a good way to put protozoa and nematodes into your system, which again are the predators of the bacteria, so they will help nutrient cycling going. But you're not going to be reaching that fungal to bacteria ratio that we talked about.
All right.
And there's a lot of nutrients too that you're going to be releasing in a water soluble form.
I know, I always thought that like water that came out of the worm stuff was like, ooh, this is like good stuff.
A lot of people do, yeah.
Darn it. Well, now I know. Do better when we know better. So then are there some species of wood chips that are better for mulch than others? And then how do untreated wood chips affect the healthy microbes? And then in high wind areas, is there another mulch or cover that you would recommend for moisture retention? And wood chips, I found that untreated, just wood chips that you get from an arborist, they don't blow around, even in crazy high wind.
Yeah, but as far as the wood chips, it's kind of complicated because it depends on their age, really, is the biggest factor. When you first chop and like start grinding it up, the wood chips are off gassing um, some terpenes, which will kill plants actually. So if you have like fresh cut and fresh chipped wood and you apply it as dressing around all of your like plants, you might actually see your plant struggling. Additionally, I find that really young chips also have like a lot of like insects and beetles, which is okay if you have healthy plants because the healthy plants will actually release exudates against that. But you might find that it'll be kind of a mess like initially. So the more aged, the better. And also wood chips, again, they're a fungal food, so it's kind of nice. That's why I like to put them in the pathways because it's a place where the fungi can also populate and then form and then release nutrients, and roots can go and access it for water and those nutrients. And so yeah, so it's something I really do like wood chips, but it's kind of like, place and time, and making sure that they're aged as much as possible. You're muted.
Sorry about that. That was the next question, is how long should the wood chips need to sit before you apply?
Yeah, and that's dependent. I've seen wood chips in piles that take a long time to break down because, water and moisture never really reaches them. Like, and then you'll pull the wood piles apart and you'll see all the terpenes off gas, and it's just nasty stuff. Or you'll have them like in, the pathways that I've put them in, and they break down because water soaks into them. They'll break down a lot faster. So it's not so much it's not so much a need. They need to age for a certain period of time. It's just like applying it fresh is where you see like the big problem. I like to let them like off gas if possible. I just don't like to put them right next to the plants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then someone's asking about the coconut core instead of wood chips, using that.
I haven't really used it. I've used it for like worm bins. But I also in my worm bins like to provide a lot of diversity. Again, that's the other thing too. It's like diversity of food. So when it comes to coconut core, there's a couple things about it. One, it's not a diverse food source. It's just one type of thing. And I don't know what microbes like thrive off of coconut core. But I like to provide a diverse set of foods. It's not a bad thing, but I just don't really know much about it.
And then someone's asking about covering hay, using hay.
Yeah, that's a good method as well. Some straw.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times there's a lot of weed seed in it, so that can produce problems as far as like getting a lot of grasses growing. And also a lot of straw and hay is treated or with maybe glyphosate or whatever. So again, it's just about the source. Like if you don't want to have any pesticides, even like residual on like straw or hay.
Yeah, that's tricky. And then what are the best tools to use to study and document your soil components and or biome?
What was that?
What are the best tools to use to study and document your soil components and or biome? I'm thinking it's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's shadow. It sounds like the answer would be shadow microscopy. So you can pick up like a fairly inexpensive shadowing microscope for like $350 or $400. And then just kind of like learning how to look at that under a microscope, and you can see all the microbial life. That's really the only way to document the microbes in your soil, or have, like I said, a lab tech analyze it, and they will send you a report. Other than that, I'm not quite sure how else to answer that question.
Yeah, maybe it's a community. We have a person in each of our communities that
that's something that I'm like trying to either do through my nonprofit Transformative or maybe through Sustainable Solano at some point, but I'm really wanting to hold like some workshops where we do extracts. Maybe we do big batches of compost tea so that people can come and get it, put it in their sprayers and go and apply the trees and stuff like that. Something that's more like mass accessible.
Absolutely. And yeah, because for me, I'm just cross-eyed with that stuff. Well, I can't. I don't know what to do.
And I saw a quick question come in too, real quick, if I can answer.
Sure.
It was about what to do about excessive pests on plants. That's one of those things too, that once you start creating healthier plants, they have like a level of succession that they go through of resiliency from pests. So you have your like aphids, which are low in succession. They're like the sap sucking insects. And as you continue moving forward into like slugs, you get them like they're munchers. And then you're moving on into like grasshoppers and things like that, which are like leaf cutters and everything. And so it moves into succession. And what we're talking about is really the phytochemicals. So as the plant gets healthier, it starts to move where it's producing more and more of those phytochemicals. It's photosynthesizing more efficiently. And as it starts to build that resiliency, it goes like higher in succession. You can get the health of your plants to where the leaves are not digestible by the simple guts of these types of like pests, so they will not eat your plants. So you just got to continue to work on the health of your plants because they will move in succession. They'll start to create more like all those minerals we're talking about, all the phytochemicals that are healthy for us to be eating. That is all like that all gets increased as you get healthier and healthier plants. And those phytochemicals are actually like, yeah, like I said, they're too complex for the gut of those insects. So you want to get it to where it's like perfect for mammals.
Yeah, I think that would answer, because someone asked about aphids. So that would be the same answer to that question.
Yeah, aphids are a hard one.
Yeah.
You know, like initially when you're trying to get all your stuff in good, into like good health, you know, using your hands, spraying it. Like I said, you can do neem, but like if it's like really bad, if you just have this outbreak, like really the only times that we want to use anything is if we just have horrible outbreaks, and then we need to come in and we need to start applying biology right away. We need to put the extracts in, we need to put compost teas right after, we need to then establish it. And once you do, you know, doing compost teas and stuff provide a certain level, a certain barrier as well.
Awesome. So someone's asking about mushrooms growing in the garden and compost piles. Is that good?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that means that you have fungi. It means you're not killing like fungi. We want diversity because, you know, so we want to have like, you know, 30 or 40 different types of fungi at least in the ground. So, you know, just like inoculating your compost piles with one type of fungi is not going to do really the trick of what we're trying to do. We want to have multiple different ones because they're going to thrive in different circumstances, you know, during different seasons, during drought, some like, you know, will do better in like wet circumstances. So we want to provide diversity. So we have things like basically nutrient cycling at all times of the year during all circumstances.
So here's another question about fertilizer. So is it not required to replenish the soil with nutrients after each season, right? After each season of growing, do we, you know, we have a mindset that we need to keep replenishing the nutrients. So what else can be used instead of fertilizer? I mean, it's the biology, right? Is that?
Yeah, it's the biology. Like I said, like you have nutrient cycling going on. So I would encourage anybody who has questions about that to look at some of the case studies that Dr. Lane Ingham has on her Soil Foodweb school. They have growers that they were working with, like for instance in Africa, who were growing tomatoes, and these growers had to continuously like move their tomato growing operation because there wouldn't be any fertile soil, the pests would be coming. So like basically they would be able to grow for like a year or two in this one area, then they would have to move it to somewhere else for like 7 years. They couldn't grow again on that spot. And so they had to keep buying more and more land because they kept degrading their soil. And so they hired Elaine Ingham to go in there and start working on their compost operation and to do the biology in the ground. And now they don't have to rotate their crops at all. Their tomato production, the yield increased 300%. And that was only after like one growing season that they were able to make that change. So it's really fast to be able to make those changes. And once you have the nutrient cycling, again, all the nutrients that we need for plants to grow are already in the soil. Aside from nitrogen, nitrogen is something I didn't get to talk about a lot, but nitrogen starts from nitrogen being pulled out of the atmosphere. And what we all probably have heard of is nitrogen fixing plants. And so these nitrogen fixing plants have these mutualistic relationships with actually an anaerobic or what's called facultative. So somewhere in the middle of aerobic and anaerobic bacteria that starts to fix onto the roots of these nitrogen fixing plants. And it becomes anaerobic within these nodules, and that actually absorbs nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And that's how we actually start to get nitrogen in the soil, in all soils. The only way we've ever gotten nitrogen out of the atmosphere and into the soil is through these types of bacteria who fix it into the soil, and then it is able to cycle through the system, through that whole system of nutrient cycling that we discussed. So we shouldn't have to add any nutrients into the soil. Maybe you can apply, if you'd like to, some seed of like clover or other types of nitrogen fixing plants, and then like chop it as it's growing, and that will release the nitrogen into your soil and get the nitrogen cycle going. But I don't think you would even need to if you're just doing some of the extracts.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question on that. It's just so the nodules on the bottoms of the plants is a good thing, and on the bottom of the roots.
It is, but a lot of times, the nodules are not what they need to be. You really should have nodules that are about the size of like a marble. And when you cut the nodules open, they should be like blood red inside. And that's the nitrogen. That's like where the nitrogen is being, brought into that anaerobic environment. And you really need to harvest the plant to release that nitrogen, because otherwise that plant's going to utilize that nitrogen. So you need to harvest that plant when it's in that like perfect stage, and then that'll release the nitrogen into the soil.
So this person grows using organic amendments, worm castings, and microbial mass pro or microbial mass additives. How do you feel about those?
I'm not familiar with the microbial mass additive. Again, there's not really a need for any products. But there are some fungi, like mycorrhizal fungi, you can buy out there, like spores. I do sometimes buy those just to add it into systems, because fungi, again, is the hard one to cultivate. But when it comes to worm castings, again, it's same as compost. Not all worm castings are created equal. A lot of times you'll buy worm castings and you'll pull it out and it's just like dust. And the biology that we're wanting needs that moisture. So if you're not getting like fresh worm castings that maybe have even had a diversity of food, then the quality is really not going to be that good. If I was to look at it under a microscope, especially the dried stuff, I've done it. I've looked at dried worm castings under a microscope, and there's just like nothing. You really want like a good diet for your worm castings. Sometimes high in carbon. When I do my worm bins, I try to put a lot of like carbon material in there, again, to try to cultivate some of the fungi, because it's not necessarily like all worm castings are created equally. It's really about the food going into the system.
So there's a question about transforming soil that is clay, predominantly clay. I don't know if that might be a little.
Yeah,
talk
That's a
about.
complex topic
Mhm.
but I will try to like summarize it really fast. So for one, it helps to add organic matter. So compost, some of your backyard compost can add some of that organic matter, but that's where bacteria starts that structure again, like we were talking about. So what happens is you have clay platelets and they stack onto each other. Much like I kind of think of like those projector sheets, those plastic sheets. If you had a couple of those, like a few of those, and they were kind of wet, and you stuck them on each other, they're gonna like they kind of like stick to each other really well. That's kind of what the clay platelets do in the ground, and so they stack on each other and they make this really hard to penetrate like soil. So what happens is the bacteria has an oppositely charged um, like electron. And so it kind of like a magnet, what it does is it sends that opposite charge electron to this clay platelets, which then starts to repel the clay platelets. Then other bacteria starts to get in between and they start to like create all their like, all their glues and all that kind of stuff. And they start to create these micro aggregates of all this stuff, which starts to create that structure. And, think of like kind of like, marbles all piled up. There's a lot of airspace in there. So they're creating all these micro aggregates. Then the fungi comes in and they're taking these micro aggregates and they're making macro aggregates. And so they're creating structure. So I've had like clay soil that after one season of applying biology, I can put my arm all the way down into my like elbow just by like digging my hand down into, or maybe even further down to my armpit. So it's possible to do it. You just really want to start working with the biology, getting the biology in the ground.
So if here's one on raised beds created, they had raised beds created by bag soil from Home Depot or somewhere. Is this likely to have any of these nutrients or?
Yeah, but the nice thing about, so when you say, would it have these nutrients, I'm thinking, would it have bad stuff? And like, it would have
Or
bad
maybe
stuff.
soil biology. I think that
Some of it,
thinking that, yeah.
yeah, some has some biology. Like I like, EB stone has actually, like I've looked at EB stones under a microscope and it actually has biology. It also has some anaerobic biology because it's in that plastic bag that's not breathable.
Mhm.
But like that's one that I would like recommend to like for people to start, if they need to. But there is also again some of those like those salts, potassium sulfate and those types of things. And but the good news is that a lot of that it is water soluble and it will eventually leach out of the system. And that's the other thing that I didn't really get a chance to put into the talk is that when you are working with microbiology, all those nutrients are not water soluble because they're in bodies. Whether it's a bacteria body or a nematode body or a protozoa body, all the nutrients are suspended in the soil. They're attached with the glue because they're in the bodies of that bacteria. So when a rain comes through, those nutrients don't go anywhere. Whereas in the case of like fertilizer, agricultural fertilizer, they have to apply a lot more than they even need because a lot of it's going to just wash out of their system in a rain because it's all water soluble. So that's the other benefit too, is we're not losing any of the nutrients. We're not creating these horrible dead zones in like the Gulf of Mexico type of thing with all of our fertilizer.
And that's actually, this next question is there a way to cleanse the salts from a raised garden bed without removing the beneficials?
Yeah, and that's just, water, putting more beneficials in because they will take care of it too. Like even the chlorine and chloramine. So we can actually even use high quality compost to filter out chlorine and chloramine because the way that it's charged, it will actually tie up some of the chlorine and chloramines. So that's another way to filter out some of those like chemicals. So it's pretty amazing what you can do with high quality compost.
And then, I mean, there's the next one is like, don't pull the weeds, right? Like, are we not pulling weeds up?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I'm for not pulling weeds unless it's starting to disturb a situation that you have. And then what I would rather do is is chop everything, chop and drop. And you know, I know that can be challenging. I know I've seen stuff get away before, but ideally you would just chop and drop, and then maybe come back a few days later or a week later and chop again and chop. And you do that maybe a few times, 4 times or so, and those like weeds will get so stressed out that they will eventually die back. And then you have all those roots and all the exudates and all the biology on those roots still in your soil. You don't want to pull them and yank them out if you can help it. Yeah.
And then there was another question, I think you answered it. It says, is straw a good item to compost? And I think it's just depending on the source, right? Is that correct? Like,
yeah, that would be correct. Also, again, we go to diversity of inputs. So when I create compost, straw is considered a high carbon. So when I create compost, I'm using a high nitrogen, like manure. I'm using a green material, could be like my garden clippings or whatever. And then I'm using a high carbon, could be straw. I go, actually what's really good, and this is what I recommend for like high carbon, is I go to like some areas like in Martinez where I like live and know, there's like briones, and there's all kinds of fallen leaves on the ground, and I go and collect that because it's in a forest. I'm hoping that there's more like predatory nematodes, and which are higher level nematodes, and I'm hoping there's like fungi on the leaves, and like, so again, it's all about the material, and I'm looking for diversity. So I might put some straw in, I'll put some leaves from briones, I'll put some leaves that I've collected off of the like street, like out front, and then like I'll go and like spend 2 or 3 days sourcing materials from like 8 different locations, trying to get not only diversity of material, but also diversity of microbes. So
ooh,
yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah.
And there was a question about, can gravel and drainage stone be worked into soil?
To some extent, I hate that stuff. I've spent days digging that out of like the ground from people. It's gonna take thousands of years to break down, but biology will break it down. So I don't hate rocks just because, like, you know, some rocks, because there is minerals in it, but to some extent it just becomes difficult for you know, to like work with. The roots will have a hard time getting past that, and so it just depends on like how much, like the concentration. So
Yeah. And just on the side note, EB Stone's actually in Solano County. It's in Sassoon, so it's a local company. And I think that's the last of the questions. If I missed any, I'm apologize. But we're just getting a lot of comments on great presentation. I mean, I think
great.
it's just people like you know, a lot of people here are Americans, and it's like, we're used to buying products for things, right?
Yeah.
So how to switch that mindset and put energy into setting it up so the system can thrive with very little to no input once it's going, because that's the ideal, right?
Yeah, I just like to go back to that picture of that beautiful old growth forest, you know, and there's so much wisdom in nature. And so I think we just have to get better at trusting nature and learning how it works, and cultivating it. And microbiology and so many levels, even our own human health, is really the new frontier.